Uh, okay. uh, okay. Uh, we'll consider how California state and local governments and the public can affordably reduce the probability and extent, the likelihood that these fires would happen, and how many houses are burned and damaged in all the Southern California foothill communities, and actually kind of in all of the communities that are at risk in California. And we will also consider how Altadena rebuilding could or should fit into the effort to minimize the risk to Altadena. Um, so this is a picture that I took. And Valerie, you can ask questions anytime that you want here. It's okay. This is a picture that I took. I just walked down the street. The lights were out, and this was the fire started about 6:30, and I walked down Meadowbrook to Allen and took this picture looking kind of northeast. And the fire had started. I'll show you some pictures of the transmission towers where the fire started. But this is what I saw at that time. So I didn't really expect that the fire might necessarily get to our neighborhood. And I wasn't really sure whether I really needed to evacuate or not, but we did. Uh, so this is a picture that was in the LA Times that shows and it's on Sinaloa, which is just up the street from us. Sinaloa above us just goes up to Mendocino, and then it changes to Porter. So that's just 2 or 3 blocks that exist above us. And this is somewhere up there above us on Sinaloa. And you can see there's a homeowner there with a garden hose, and he's standing on a roof, and he's watering that roof. The house across there is gone, basically. And I just wanted to show this because this was a very common thing. We had other neighbors who stayed and fought the fire around their houses. So I don't know if you know people that were around where you were, Valerie, but that certainly was common here. And I'm guessing that if there in future fires that happen in LA County after what has happened in Altadena and the firefighters not being able to get to a lot of the houses that burned because of that there may be even more people staying. So this is all kind of part of the solution and part of the problem for the future that I wanted to show that there was definitely a problem that the firefighter resources were just not sufficient to get to most of the houses that needed to be protected. There was one of our neighbors on Meadowbrook, Jose, I can't remember his last name, who came right to our corner there of Sinaloa and Meadowbrook and helped fight fires there. So our house didn't burn, but 4 houses right across the street from us on Sinaloa burned. So we were kind of in the edge of the fire zone, but it just depended on where the little streaks of fire came down from house to house. And we were sort of in the middle of an area that didn't burn, but there were streaks on either side of us that did. So we were lucky rather than good. So this is the picture of the area where the fire started. You can see the transmission towers there, Valerie. This picture was taken about a month after the fire on February. It was taken on February 8th, and most of the vegetation is burned off. But you can see the area there where the fire started, and I'll show you some pictures about that in a minute. These are pictures that a homeowner took who lived over on the slope over there near the transmission towers, and she saw the sparks and then she saw the fire under the transmission tower, which she took pictures of. And for a while, that was the only the only pictures that existed. And then investigators found security camera footage from a service station that was in the area and that showed the same thing. So it's very definitely the fire started under these transmission towers. Edison is still denying that its equipment started the fire, but that's not they're not going to be able to persist with that. It's pretty clearly it did. And then I wanted to show you this picture, which is the same towers picture taken before the fire, just to show you what the vegetation looked like before it burned. And this kind of vegetation is it's called chaparral. I'll tell you about that in a bit. And it's a very flammable type of vegetation that doesn't burn often, but when it burns intensely hot. And so it's a part of learning about how these fires work is learning about chaparral vegetation. So this is a map of what the map says is shrublands, but it's also the other word for it is chaparral. These dark green patches are the chaparral, and you can see that Altadena is right on the south edge of the chaparral, a big chaparral area up there. So once a fire gets started here, it can go in all directions. It can go up to Mount Wilson, or it can go sideways along the mountain range, and it did that to some extent. Pacific Palisades, which is the other area that burned, there's the same. It's kind of a shrub-like vegetation that exists along there, and it burned as well. So then the fire characteristics of chaparral, we're talking about the wildland above LA County foothill communities. It has chaparral, which is sort of woody. I don't know, Valerie, if you've seen some of the chaparral shrubs like toyon, with the red berries, and coffeeberry, and see, what are some of the others, Cynthia?
Well, it's mixed with sugar bush, and I mean, she might not know, and
right.
ceanothus.
Right. So these, all these kind of, they're not exactly trees, but they can get, some are kind of like small trees, like toyon is, I guess you call it a tree. It can get like 20 feet high or something like that. We have one at our house, right at the south edge of our house. The thing about chaparral is that it evolved with fire, and it requires fire to propagate. So if it never had any fire, it would all die and be gone. And so, so it requires fire to live. But if the fires happen too often, then it reduces its viability and its strength, and eventually it will. Pretty soon it will die out and be replaced by grass. And in the area of LA County, that generally means non-native grass. And so for the chaparral health, the ideal burning frequency is like every 30 to 90 years. And we almost achieved that in Altadena. The last fire that burned over at Eaton Canyon was almost 30 years ago. That fire burned the nature center down there, which again, it burned down again this time. When the fire frequency is a lot faster, like if you're going to do controlled burns, reproduction is reduced, and eventually the stand is replaced with non-native grass. Non-native grass can tolerate frequent burning, doesn't kill it. It's much more flammable. It ignites easier than chaparral, and it burns much more often than chaparral. So it has advantages and disadvantages for firefighting. it burns somewhat cooler than chaparral, which is an advantage in firefighting, but the fire moves much faster, which is a definite disadvantage, because that was one of the problems that we had with the Aladina fire. It took about 15 minutes from the time that the fire was observed to start until it was at the edge of the houses. And they just were not able to react and quickly enough, particularly since a lot of firefighters were down in Palisades fighting that fire. The other thing about grass is it doesn't anchor the hillsides very well, not nearly as well as chaparral, so you would get a lot more mudslides, which can be very damaging. So I mean, so there's a kind of a trade-off here, and but hardly anyone recommends trying to get rid of the chaparral by burning it off and then getting grass, which you'd have to do control burns a lot more frequently, and it just isn't practical. So the fire agencies, including the California one, CAL FIRE, and the national one, the U.S. Forest Service policy is not to do control burns in chaparral, not to do extensive brush cutting, because either of them will degrade the stand and will lead to having just native non-native grass. So that's sort of the policy that we have, and it's hard to argue with it. LA County wildland then will always have infrequent, dangerous, very hot when chaparral burns, it burns very hot, very fast moving, and the fires that are hard to start in it are generally in very windy conditions, Santa Ana winds. And so when you have these fires, it potentially can create an Aladina-like outcome. So basically the story here is that this can happen, and so you need to somehow be able to react when number one, you want to try to keep it from igniting, and then if and when a fire ignites, you want to be able to react very quickly to put it out before it burns dozens or hundreds of houses to the point where the fire departments can't deal with it. So that's the kind of a situation we're in that we can't really get out of. So fire response experts generally support the following narrative. First of all, fire department staffing and water resources are sized for occasional house fires, not large-scale community fires. And we saw that in the picture I showed earlier of the homeowner on Sinaloa Avenue out there with his garden hose. He was doing that because the fire departments, not only the county fire department, but Pasadena Fire Department and a number of other fire departments and fire resources that had come in from eventually came in from Northern California and elsewhere, was not able to get the fire under control. So the increased staffing and water resources, the experts believe, while needed and useful, cannot be affordably increased to the extent needed to prevent major events. And the problem is that these fires may occur only every 10 or 20, or in this case, almost every 30 years. You cannot afford to have large numbers of people standing around waiting to fight the fire for 30 years. It's not affordable, and so you need some other way to do it, which we'll get into what the alternatives are for that in a little bit. So another conclusion was when extremely strong winds create a conflagration, fire response cannot regain control until the wind subsides. Many homes burn completely before any firefighter arrives. Because of this, the experts prioritize avoiding ignition, home hardening, and early fire suppression. And then if all that fails, then you need some way to use the resources that you got to fight the fire. And we'll talk about that as well. Many experts believe that home hardening would be the most effective of those they believe that it's going to be very difficult to avoid ignition. You've got pyromaniacs, you've got power line ignitions, you've got accidental ignitions by vehicles throwing off sparks, or construction equipment, and so forth. And the early fire suppression is very hard to react quickly enough in a very strong wind to be able to stop the fire. So none of the experts confidently predict that any combination of these measures will prevent future Altadena-like disasters. So this is a very unsatisfactory situation to be in, to have such little confidence that the things that are being done to try to prevent these events from happening are really going to work for you in the future. And so we're going to be talking about that. What are some options for this? Wind-driven wildlife urban interface fire ignition conclusions from an article, a scientific article in Fire Ecology magazine by Keeley and Sippard, 2019, titled 21st Century California USA Wildfires, Fuel-Dominated versus Wind-Dominated Fires. So some of the conclusions from there are that the wildlife urban interface ignitions are almost always human caused, and that can either be from power lines not being maintained properly or not being able to be controlled properly, or it can be from various accidental or intentional ignitions by humans. Lightning fires in Southern California extremely rare. You have some considerably more in Northern California. That's another situation. I'll get to that. And it's a very different situation up there than in Southern California. Ignitions from power lines usually occur during extreme wind events when most catastrophic fires occur. So 5 of those 6 most destructive wind-driven fires from 2003 to 2018 were power line ignitions. This included the 2018 Camp Fire, which had included the town of Paradise, had 18,804 structures, which is twice the number of structures that were lost in Altadena, and 88 lives lost versus, I think, 21 or 20 something and 29 now in Altadena. Fuels play a minor role in controlling the size of the large wind-dominated fires. The primary means of heading off these catastrophic fires is not by fuel treatments such as control burns, brush burning, but with the prevention of human ignitions, particularly during severe wind events. And so this table is from the same article, and now you can look at what the authors call fuel-dominated fires, and the difference here is in the Northern California, and say in the Sierras, those are true forests there. They're not chaparral, and there's been a long tradition up there of suppressing fires, and so you have a big buildup of fuel in there that when it burns, it can burn really hot, and so there's definitely helps to keep these fires from being disasters to have done control burns and brush cleaning out and so forth. And you notice that the cause of those fires it's not, there's 3 lightnings and 1 campfire. So it was more natural starts than human started. The amount of acreage is pretty comparable to the ones down below, which are wind driven. But you look then at the lives lost and the structures destroyed, and there were no lives lost, and there were hardly any structures except in the In the rim fire, you lost 112 structures, which seems like a lot, but it's not a lot compared to look at the number of structures lost in the wind-driven fire. So there's really two different areas with two different kinds of fires, and the way that you deal with these fires is different in north and south. The wind-driven fires, you can see, as I mentioned before, are mainly from power line ignitions. And there's one that came from some flares. I don't know whether that's fireworks or what that's supposed to be. Maybe somebody set a flare after an accident or something. I don't know what happened there. Also has the number of days of Santa Ana winds down below, and you can see that on the very damaging wind-driven fires, there was always Santa Ana winds. And so when you think about the Altadena fire, we had winds that actually were coming on and off, I think, for about 17 days. And certainly for the first several days, there was strong winds that were gusting up to about 80 miles an hour. So the Altadena fire was wind-driven, and it had power line ignition. The fire started with sparks from the Edison transmission line pole, which I showed you. The current information that's coming out from utility experts, including eventually Edison's going to agree to this, is that electric grid instability, which was triggered in shutting off the power if the equipment's not been maintained quite properly, and if it's not done carefully enough, you can have surges of power on the grid at the time that you shut off power. And there's evidence that this happened in this case, and then so it caused the sparking, it caused the fire. So the Edison's fire prevention strategy, which has been trimming vegetation near power lines, insulating distribution lines, and shutting off power in extreme wind events, failed in this case. High voltage transmission lines carry too much voltage, so they cannot be insulated. So the insulation that Edison's doing is all on the distribution lines, which are the lower voltage ones that go into people's houses. But the high voltage ones that are carrying power long distances cannot be insulated. Burying all these lines offers the most ignition protection. That's particularly true for the transmission lines, but it is expensive, roughly $3 million a mile. And so so everyone wanting to spend less sort of was hopeful that trimming vegetation and insulating distribution lines was good enough, and clearly that didn't work. And so to date, most of the distribution and the transmission lines have not been done. And so the question is, should the transmission lines in the wildland urban interface, should those transmission lines be undergrounded, even though that would increase electricity costs particularly? And so that's one of the issues that's going to be important going forward. And so it's kind of a cost benefit thing. And we have seen that the costs are much greater than we realized. Nobody had any idea that we could have a fire like the Altadena fire that would cause $250 billion in economic damages. It's a huge amount. So when you start looking at $3 million a mile and compare that to 250 billion, these undergrounding costs are minuscule. And so it's still a TBD, what's going to happen. And this is only part of it. It has to do with the ignition protection. But it's hard to see why it would be sensible to continue trimming vegetation and trying to insulate lines and shut off power when that didn't work for us in Altadena. Why you would want to do that as your primary strategy in the future. Modern California building codes for new construction produce significantly better fire survival rates. In 2018, the towns of Paradise and Concal, California, experienced the state's deadliest and most destructive wildfire to date. That was deadliest and most destructive. I guess it still is. We looked at the numbers, and there was lots more houses burned and people died in Paradise than in Altadena. Both towns were largely destroyed. And as town officials surveyed the damage and looked toward the future, they found one factor correlated with homes that survived the fire: newer building codes. Homes built after implementation of modern fire protection mitigation codes fared much better than those built prior to those changes. Of the 350 homes in the former category, that is, having the modern building codes, 51% survived, according to a 2019 analysis of fire and property records by McClatchy journalists. Of the 12,100 homes built prior to the new codes, only 18% were left. So clearly there's a significant advantage to having the new buildings. However, that's on the glass half full perspective. But if you think of a glass half empty perspective, the new homes only 51% survived. So that means if you had a home. So what we really don't know from all these numbers is how clustered these homes were, because you can think of it that new homes put around each other would protect each other. And if they're on the other hand, if they're dispersed and intermixed with the others, then they wouldn't, having those new homes wouldn't help as much. So this applies, Valerie, to Altadena. If you're in an area where almost all the houses burned and you rebuild to modern codes, the houses will protect each other. So we don't really know, nobody really knows exactly, because we haven't had the kind of fires that where you have large numbers of new homes clustered. That's fairly rare. There are some. There were a few examples of a few houses that were clustered together where a wind-driven fire came down a canyon in Southern California and they all burned. So clearly you're not bulletproof from having new homes clustered, but we don't know exactly, we don't have enough experience with that to know exactly how protected you are. I guess you'd like it to be good, but so that's still not very satisfactory. Then there's a National Academy of Sciences report called Chemistry of Fires in the Wildlife-Urban Interface, which is put out in 2022. So it's before the Altadena fire. And they're again quoting these authors. This is a different article than the one that I referenced. It was the same year and the same authors, different author order. And this article showed that the National Academy of Sciences, which is kind of the gold standard of science conclusions, showed that the impact of mitigation actions in these severe fires was only modest. Now, to some extent, that is undoubtedly because a large number of the houses are made, certainly in Southern California, the vast majority of houses are built long before 1990. In fact, the median age is like 40 years old, and our house was built in 1930, so it's almost 100 years old. There's a lot of houses like ours in our neighborhood. So when those houses were built, people weren't concerned, neither the builders nor us. Nobody was concerned about fire safety. We didn't think there was a problem. And so people built with wood, and they didn't build in the way that the modern standards are built. And it turns out that it's not easy to fix that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. This article by Siffard and Keeley concluded that the most effective actions were using covered eaves, multi-pane windows, and screen vents to reduce ignition risk. And the way that, and the reason why those things are showing up is these are the measures you can take to keep wind-driven embers from getting into your house. And once those embers get into your house, then they can get at the flammable parts of the interior and set the house on fire. So they're not. So the most important things are not the roofs. The roofs tend to be pretty almost entirely very fire resistant. They got rid of the old shake roofs now, and it's not even exactly walls, although the bottom parts of walls is important too. So they found that maintaining this defensible space around the house was less effective, showing that the significance of ember ignitions, since embers can travel as far as 1 kilometer. Well, they can actually, in the Aladina fire, they traveled like 1.5 miles. They jumped all the way over the Eaton Canyon golf course, all the way over to Calaveras, over west of the Aladina golf course, which was a mile or 1.5 miles from the original fire. And that was not the only time that the flames jumped from place to place. So so in these extreme fires, wind-driven fires, it tends the number one priority is protecting against the wind-driven embers, and then you also would like to protect against the radiant heat from having houses near you burning, and that's what the multi-pane windows partly. That's the case. You don't want, if they're not multi-pane, they're likely to burn and they're likely to break in a fire or melt more readily. And once those windows are gone, the embers can go right into your house and burn it down. So these things are none of them extremely difficult to do, and would certainly help a lot. But there are a lot of other things, and we're not going to have time to talk about it in any detail today. But I know from our own experience with our own house how many wood parts we have. We have wood on the porches, on the undersides of the porches, the tile roof on the top, which is very good, but the underside is wood, and you have wood beams sticking out from under the tile to the front and to the back of the house that could catch on fire. And these things are a lot harder to protect. And so there's been a lot of talk about defensible space, and there's so-called 5-foot rule when you're supposed to be required to clear all the vegetation within 5 foot of your house. But there's considerable actually, I guess you'd call it controversy about that, because there are quite a few researchers are finding that if the vegetation around your house is well hydrated, is kept well watered, and particularly if it's watered down before the fire, that is actually protects you against fire instead of carrying the fire to you. And so that the trees and the bushes that are well hydrated can actually shield you against the wind-driven embers to some extent. And so it's not clear whether people should take out all the trees that maybe overhang their house or planted fairly close to the house, or whether they should take out all the bushes that may be within a few foot of their house. That's still going to be worked out. Mitigation measures to the structure and its surroundings may not be sufficient to reduce risk in some fire-prone landscapes. Keeley and Sifford, 2019, that's the one I referenced to begin with, noted landscape features that were common in some destructive fires. For example, developments on the edge of canyons, Aladina certainly has that, or within a wind corridor. And wind corridors mean the winds sort of get channeled. And so I don't know if you've experienced this or not, Valerie, but there may be Santa Ana winds predicted, and in your particular location, you don't get any, but somewhere else a few miles away, you get a lot. And so the winds get channeled. That means they're stronger where they do occur. Additionally, some California coastal areas, despite repeated fire, have rapid regrowth of vegetation. That's true of around Altadena, and seasonal meteorology, weather, that creates hazardous conditions. For instance, dry fuels and strong winds that lead to destructive fires. So the kind of the message here is, despite your best efforts, you can't reduce all the risks to the extent that you would like, and you may still have some disasters happening. So all these insufficient mitigation measures suggest finding outside the box improvements, and these are the four things that you can do to try to keep from having a future Altadena. You can have the home hardening, avoiding fire ignition, particularly the transmission lines could be buried. Firefighting water availability, and there's a problem with that, which I guess I haven't mentioned. Besides the firefighters not having enough of them, when you're trying to pour water on as many fires, like hundreds of, maybe thousands of fires at a time, there's just not enough water storable locally to necessarily put it all out. So if the fire gets to the point where there's thousands of structures burning, there's not going to be enough water. And that's what all the experts are telling you. So the thing is that in order to have enough water, you have to get the water on the buildings to keep the buildings from burning to begin with, so that instead of having thousands, maybe you only have tens, or maybe not very many, so that the firefighters can get to those if and when they catch fire. But the firefighters are not going to be overstressed, and the water supply won't be overstressed. And normally when firefighters fight a fire, they need 4 engines to come to one house fire. And so when you have thousands, they're just not, you can't have that kind of resources. So we need some kind of firefighting that somehow can overcome that obstacle of not having enough firefighters and not having enough, and the water availability is partly getting more water, but to a large extent, it's somehow keeping large number of buildings from being on fire at once, because once that happens, there's no way to have enough water.
George, I just had an idea.
Yes.
What if you had some kind of little firefighting robots that would have enough water to put out a fire in one house that could just roll down the street to the house and put out the fire?
That's a possibility, actually. They would have to be able to navigate over curbs and over obstacles and stuff. So it isn't.
But mainly they could just roll down the street.
Well, they'd want to go in from the street. They'd have to go in the driveway or some way to get up to the building.
Right.
There's a way to do it.
Because they'd be small.
Right. Well, so we're going to talk about some automated or robotic ways to do this, and that's one
George?
of them. It doesn't seem to be the first one that's going to come, but
George,
yes.
what is home hardening?
Home hardening is building, or when you build new or when you remodel, that you put in fire resistant materials. You screen any kind of a vent either in your basement or in your attic, so that the embers can't get in there into that flammable space, because there's no firefighting capability up there. The homeowners are gone, and so if you get a few embers up there, say in your attic, it'll sit there and smolder, and then it'll catch on fire. And it may be many hours after the original fire started, but the homeowner's gone. There's no way that they can fight that fire. it's also roofs and particularly walls. You want stucco walls that turns out are fairly fire resistant. Concrete is really good. Wood is not good generally. It's very flammable. We had a neighbor just across the street, their house burned, and they had a lot of wood in their sidewalls. And it definitely wasn't a good thing. We had, you don't want wooden sheds, and a lot of people, we had one that we shouldn't have had, probably. It didn't burn, but you don't want wooden fences that come right up to your house. This is all, so getting rid of that kind of situation is part of home hardening. Hardening it so it doesn't burn is really what they're talking about. Did I answer that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so so all of these are important, all four of them, and it's not like, you know, some people say, well, some of these you're never going to do a very good job, and so they prioritize the others, and everybody gets to do this, but really, considering how the disaster we've been through, you really want to do as good a job as you can of all of them. They work together. So as an example of thinking outside the box, now we're kind of getting into the automated response to fires that doesn't involve firefighters, or at least not very much. Some foothill community homeowners are considering installation of diesel powered, or could be propane powered, I guess, auxiliary generators and on-site water storage. And that could be existing swimming pools, which doesn't cost anything extra if you already have it, or new water tanks. I know I had someone come up to me when I was visiting our house there after the fire, and was telling me that they were intending to try to do this. Also heard a talk by, I think it was Pasadena Audubon, was it, Cynthia?
Yes.
Pasadena Audubon had a meeting in Monrovia. They normally meet at Eaton Canyon Nature Center, but it had burned, and had a former fire department firefighter who was telling about the subject of using the auxiliary generator and on-site water storage. So you use the way this works is the power generators which are separate from the regular grid. So even if the power goes down in the grid, you still have this power. And on-site water storage means that you can provide high pressure water to external sprinklers that spray the outside of buildings. And these are large droplet, not a mist. They're large, kind of like a stream more than a mist. Stray nozzles that are activated, that can be activated quite often by a temperature sensor. There are other ways to do it. I'll talk about that in a bit. Fire retardant added to the water can improve performance. The cost estimates for this range from anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000 per house or more, depending on how much water you're going to store and how many nozzles and what capabilities and so forth. Most homeowners would probably not install such expensive systems, so their homes wouldn't be protected. If you have a house and you don't install this kind of thing, then your house is not very well protected. Certainly, and so if there's only a few in the community that are protected and you're not one of them, you're not well protected with this at all. Also, fires in unprotected homes would threaten the homes that were protected, because, you know, when you have these fires around them, the radiant heat can be, you know, can overwhelm, potentially overwhelm it. So having just individual homeowners do this, although it's good, and I can understand why people would want to do it, they're not going to be as protected as if they and all their neighbors did it, number one. And number two, the unprotected neighbors are not protected if only a few people have done this. So it's just having a few people here and there do this kind of protection, paying for it themselves, is not really protecting the community very well. And so another option, there are other options to do this that are arguably are much better options. A state-funded neighborhood system is a much better option for this. State-funded because that way you get out of the, trying to rely on individual homeowners to come up with the money to do something like what we looked at in the previous slide just isn't going to happen. It's not practical. But if it's state funded, and if you do it in a neighborhood sense, it's kind of obvious that it's much more efficient to protect whole small neighborhoods than it is individual houses, because then you can share water resources within that little local section, and you can share the power generator, so you don't have to have a separate one for every house. And because it's neighborhood, then it's easy to pay for it state funded. So everybody would have it. So if you did this kind of a system, you might have a neighborhood system that each might serve perhaps a few blocks of a single street. And in this case, installation for each house would probably be mandatory. It isn't a choice. It isn't something that you have to sign on to. You have to have it. And because it protects not only you, but it protects your neighbors as well. So this is kind of a community or a state decision as to whether to do this. It could be a controversial subject to have the state say mandate installing this. And if it's not mandatory, maybe it would still work. I don't know if enough houses were covered by it. This is something that could be done in Altadena in the rebuild section. So it might. So where would you put the water storage and power generators? Well, the best way to protect them against fire and to be unobtrusive is to put them under streets, and that is doable. Altadena rebuilding would be a good opportunity for a pilot project to try this out. So the thing is, okay, so let me go ahead and talk a little about the communities that have done this sort of thing. So the goal is for a combined complementary firefighter. You have firefighters coming in, but you also have the automated system, because there will be most properties and one of these fires are coming down through the chaparral, in order to protect them and keep them from catching on fire. The firefighters are not going to be there to do it. And so you need something like the sprinkler system. And the intention is that by doing this, by protecting all of your structures, that hardly any would catch on fire. And so the fire department would easily be able to protect the few that do catch on fire. And so there wouldn't be an Altadena, there wouldn't be really a major loss of life or houses. So ideally, so you want to try to save most and ideally all structures from burning. The potential effectiveness of exterior fire sprinklers was proven during the 2007 wind-driven Ham Lake fire in Cook County, Minnesota. In 2001, which was before that fire, exterior sprinklers were installed on 188 properties, including homes and a number of resorts. All 188 properties survived the fire. More than 100 neighboring properties were destroyed. And the reference for this is a 2018 online article. Exterior fire sprinklers saved 188 properties. Wet homes don't burn. That was an attachment to the reminder email. I don't know if you looked at that or not, Valerie. Did you see that? I can't hear you.
No, I'm sorry. I said, it's been a while now, so I don't know. I need to go back and look and see if I did look at it.
Okay. Ruth I mentioned Ruth Judkins didn't get to participate today. She intended to, but she got pulled off on things. But when she sent me the email, she said she had read this article, and she said the property just across the street from her, hers burned, but the property just across the street from her didn't. And she said it was because it got wet. So she agreed with the statement, wet homes don't burn, but she didn't explain how it got wet. So I didn't have a chance to ask her, but so it's kind of obvious that wet homes don't burn,
Right.
I guess. So anyway, there are examples. This was a wind-driven fire, but more R&D is needed before you do a large-scale implementation. Exterior sprinklers performed well in the Ham Lake fire that we just discussed, with the winds gusted to 20 to 25 miles per hour. However, these systems should be tested in winds gusting to, I've seen various numbers for the peak speeds in Altadena, I think like 80 miles an hour, maybe, mostly. There might have been occasionally one to go to 100, but I think that would be rare. But still, that's like 4 times greater, say, than the wind speeds in Minnesota for the case we saw.
Oh, you know what? Just an aside, I was going to look back at that email that you were talking about, and I saw that the email address that I had for Constance isn't any good.
Oh,
This was in my directory from the league.
no, I had an email. I sent her a link from George's email list.
What, do you know what that email address is?
I'll give it to you after the.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, Connie, she could have called me. She has my telephone number, and so I don't know what happened. We'll find out later. So anyway, what the article, when you read it, they say, well, winds mainly affect the spray pattern, water spray pattern above the roof. If you think about it, if you have sprinklers up above the roof and you try to spray out and you have a wind coming across, it'll probably just blow that water clear off. But for the rest of the structure, there was hardly any effect, at least at 25-mile-an-hour winds. It was still getting the sides of the building wet, and it was getting the part wet down, the vegetation surrounding the house. So the bottom part of the part that's really the most vulnerable, the vegetation right near the house, and the part of the walls on the outside that are right next to the ground, getting those wet is definitely important. And it's kind of clear that in most cases, it's more important to protect those parts than it is the roof. The roofs, and all the experts are saying in California now are very fire resistant. They've got rid of all of the old shake roofs that we used to have a problem with. And so it's tile and it's asphalt roofs, but they're fire protected. And so most of the fires don't start from the roof. And when the wall fires tend to be most vulnerable down near the ground. So if you can get that wet down there, it's a big advantage. So regardless of the fact that it may be that it'll be hard to get the roof reliably wet, that may not matter that much. Also, one of the things you want to do is one of the problems with the fire getting into structures is through the eaves, where the roof line hangs out over the wall, and if you get that wet, it's definitely an advantage. So there's a lot of different designs you can think about for where the nozzles ought to be and how they spray. And you want to get the eaves wet, you want to get the lower walls wet, you want to get the vegetation wet, and then the rest of it you want to do too, to the best you can. But the perfect is the enemy, the good here, and maybe the good is good enough to proceed with it. It's just that, this whole idea of, well, it won't work because of the winds. And a lot of people say that when they're confronted with this idea. You see that in the article if you read it provided. The only way you really settle this is to test it out in a high wind. And as far as the water coverage and whether things get wet, you don't have to have a fire to do this. You just have to have a wind. And so if so obviously this is doable. You can have these systems working on buildings, wait for a nice Santa Ana wind, try it out and prove that it does its job. And so I'm a sort of a technical person, I guess, and to my mind, this is a doable research thing to do. It isn't something you have to guess at. You can actually build these systems and try them out on a wind and see what happens. And but to reject the idea of actually doing this without ever testing it just doesn't make a lot of sense, considering how bad the problem is. So so there's some issues about when these systems are going to be turned on. You don't want them turned on too many hours before the fire gets there because you might run out of water. And so that's the idea of thermocouples. You wait until the fire gets there close enough that you get temperature increases, and then the temperature increase will trigger the water to come on. The problem with that is that if you have a wind-driven fire, you may have just a few embers come, which could light your house on fire before you ever had enough temperature increase to trigger the system. So you could also, to counteract that, you could, particularly for a neighborhood system, you could have the whole neighborhood system turned on by a fire department centralized control center using automated camera images from the neighborhood, temperature measurements and wind measurements, or you could have firefighters turn it on, from the local area. So you might want a system where you would have the thermocouples, but you have all these options to turn it on before the thermocouple would ask for it. And that would be safer and more effective. So this seems like it's kind of a solvable problem as far as getting it turned on at the right time. The fire response improvements should obviously be partnered with home hardening so that the embers don't go through openings. The exteriors may be wet, but if you have openings that let embers go through into the dry part, the house will catch on fire. So you still have to, you need to do, and these are the simple, easy things like putting in screens to keep the embers out and so forth. So putting in tile roofs kind of have the tiles have kind of a arch shape, and the embers can get up under it on the wood that's under there. If you need something, I think it's called kind of a stop at the bottom of the tiles, and none of this is super expensive. So and this can and should be done on existing houses. And considering that if you don't do a good job of this, you're putting your neighbor at risk. One of the questions here is what we've always done is on existing houses, we've not been requiring people to do things. All the new building code requirements don't apply to existing housing. They're encouraged, but they're not, right now, they're not required. So, but you can, if there's enough of a fire hazard, and we're beginning to see there's a strong argument to start making them mandatory. And then the question is, who's going to pay for these, even though they're not super expensive, who's going to pay for it? And it could be that you should have the pay for part be from the state, but still be required that the homeowner do it and then get reimbursed, something like that. I don't know. So this is all things that isn't even being really talked about much at this point, but it's kind of obvious that if you really want to protect yourself, protect the community in the future, you're probably going to need to have a more mandatory things that the homeowners have to do. These simple things to protect against embers have to be done in order to, you want to do both. You want to protect so the embers don't get in, and you want the outside of the building to be wet. And if you do both of those things, then probably your community's not going to burn. And it's not. So we'll talk about expense in a minute. So the planning, the funding, the R&D, and the installation should be a California state government responsibility. It's not, homeowners are not up to the, homeowners cannot do neighborhood systems. It's a government thing. Local communities don't have the expertise or the money to do it. The state would have to get involved. The federal government could get involved too. FEMA has partnered. We saw in a previous slide that they'd funded the system in Minnesota that worked. They could do it. They could do it in the future if the national politics permits, and we just don't know whether that's possible at this point. So it may be that California, but if the federal government's not willing, California is the only ones that can do it, the California state government. So what is the cost of installing neighborhood exterior sprinkler systems in all California high fire zone structures? This is north and south. And this applies both to the, so there are houses that burn in Northern California as well in the south. So if you did all these high fire zones, the number of structures is roughly 1 million. But these zones are going to be enlarged and are being enlarged after the Eaton Palisades fire experiences. I know they're enlarging the one in Altadena to be bigger, the fire zone. Assume a rough estimate of $25,000 per structure to install a neighborhood exterior sprinkler system. So the total state cost for the current high fire zones would be, if you figure this out, is $25 billion, which is almost 1/10 of the total state government debt, which is $270 billion, so that's significant. But then, so that's kind of on the glass half empty part of the thing, but it's also 1/10 of the total economic cost of the Altadena fire. So for the 1/10 of what the Altadena fire cost us in economic terms, you could protect the whole high fire zone structures in all of the state. So why would you not do that? Normally, the federal government would share in such a major expenditure. I totally talked about that. This just may not be possible. I wish it was. Normally, you go to the federal government for money this big, but if they're not willing to do it, I don't think California can afford to do nothing and just rely on home hardening and keep your fingers crossed. It doesn't seem very, that doesn't work well for existing structures. So the state goal should be to minimize total overall costs, which includes the fire costs, includes most of the insured damage, other economic costs. As I mentioned, there's Altadena Fire, $250 billion in costs there, and insurance policy costs, which are going to rise in the future with increased payouts due to the fire events. The insurance cost problem will remain even if the state eventually self-insures. It may be that this will drive the private insurers out of the state. They will decide they can't make money providing insurance, and this is starting to happen somewhat. And it could well progress to where the state is on its own. That's a very bad situation to be in. You don't want the state self-insuring itself. So clearly you need to cut the fire risk so that the insurance costs don't go through the ceiling. Fire mitigation costs, which is the way that you avoid all these fire costs up here, includes fire response, water availability, ignition avoidance, and home hardening. So the overall cost is minimized by choosing fire mitigation measures that produce the smallest total of fire costs plus fire mitigation costs. But in actuality, it appears, I guess I'm making the argument that the fire mitigation costs are going to pay you back in many multiples of reductions in the fire costs. So that it's sort of a note. California then faces a pay me now with fire mitigation, that is fire response, water availability, so forth, ignition avoidance, home hardening, or pay me later with much greater fire costs, including insurance. And so why would we not, I guess from a logical standpoint, why would you not do this? But we're still sort of, there's still we're still not very far along the road to doing something like this. The difficult, often controversial political question of who pays the costs for mitigation, when should the costs be shifted to the state, will affect how fire risk is mitigated. And then there's what we've been looking at here before was kind of an economic cost benefit analysis, but the fire deaths, the trauma, the stress, and the long-term health effects should arguably motivate a much stronger fire risk mitigation than suggested by just an economic cost benefit analysis. So apart from the money part of this, and that you'd save a huge amount of money by doing better on the fire response, you have all these other things which are really should motivate you to do a much better job with this. So the current sluggish fire risk mitigation public debate, the public debate is going on, resembles the debate before the fire. So in spite of the fact that we had this huge damage in Altadena and Pacific Palisades, the debate's sort of going on as if it's never happened. And there's not really much sense of urgency that I'm seeing on anybody's part to do better on this. Mostly what you see is, well, we'll just work on home hardening and the other things that are too expensive, and people claim that this is going to be good enough. But there's no reason to be confident in that at all. And so it's not, Valerie, it's not just up to the public or to the government as to what's good enough. It's to some extent, it's up to the insurance companies, because if they feel like the risks are too high, they're going to either not provide insurance at all, or they're going to provide insurance at extremely high cost. So that's part of the pay me later, besides the fact that you may likely have, I hope they're not as bad as Altadena, but significantly bad foothill fires. And then you also have the insurance getting to be super unaffordable. This is not the way you want to go with it. So it may be it's hard to tell. It may be that state and local governments and the public may not act decisively until they experience more catastrophic fires and or widespread loss of fire insurance coverage. There will be some people. What's happening when the fire insurance is it's kind of a cost shift from the people who are in the high fire zones to everybody else in the state. So everybody in the state is going to experience the fire insurance to a significant extent, regardless of whether their own house is in a high fire zone or not. So this is going to get more people to be concerned. And then if there's another fire, say in Rock Center or La Cañada or Azusa or wherever it is, that certainly would motivate people to do something. So, but what's not clear is if you just based on the Pasadena and the Altadena and Pacific Palisades fire, whether this is going to be sufficient. And there's no way to tell until we just wait and see what happens. And so what you would like to see is that this California state government should have a serious concern. They should do some kind of a serious, quick study of the problem and make some plans as to doing the research and development for the fire response and to actually implement it so that we can reduce the risks and so we don't have any more communities burning and we don't have super insurance rate problems. So in order, you know, they need to act quickly and decisively, but that's not likely to happen without strong citizen support, which I don't see right now. I don't see that support out there. And so that's a concern. How can that happen, I guess? And so I don't have an answer for this exactly, but it definitely in order, you know, in order for the things to happen that need to happen, people have to be more motivated than they are now. And I don't know if that's going to happen or not. Global removal of carbon from the atmosphere, you know, the atmospheric warming, global warming is, the fire scientists say, is definitely a part of the problem. It's creating more severe shifts between drought and too much water. And when there's too much water, everything grows and then it dies back, has dead material, and then you get a big long drought, which we did this last time. And then the wind comes, and the wind was stronger. I don't know if that pattern will continue or not, but the Altadena wind was stronger and lasted longer than most of the Santa Anas. And so the scientists are saying that this is all caused by global warming. It's caused by the amount of carbon that's up in the atmosphere now. And if that's too much, you really need, in order to make things better, you need to take carbon down in the atmosphere below what it is now. But what is really happening globally is that we not only have not brought the emissions down to zero, where the emissions are about as high as they've ever been. They've just gone down a few percent from the peak. And so we're putting large amounts of carbon up in the atmosphere. And so eventually that means you're going to have to take a lot more carbon out of the atmosphere to get significantly below where we are now. And all this is happening on the plans for getting down to net zero are like 2050, and China and India are not agreeing to that. They're talking about more like 2060 or 2070. So global removal of carbon to help this problem. So there's two messages from this. One is things are going to get, climate-wise, are going to get worse for the next few decades than they are now, progressively worse. And the other thing is that in order to fix that, you're going to have to take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere eventually in order to, and you really want to be back to where we are now. It's going to get a lot worse later on than it is now. You have to bring the carbon in the atmosphere back to where we are now and then take it down a ways further than that. And that's going to be difficult. And it's not clear, and that's a global response. It's not something the United States controls. California certainly doesn't control. And so there's definitely a connection to climate change here that is important. And so what's happening with the burning of Altadena and the other California communities is it's a result of just to some extent of climate change, and that statement's going to be truer in the future than it is now. And in order trying to improve the fire response is a kind of climate change adaptation. So we're adapting to climate change in the moment by improving our fire response. And that is, we have to do, but in the long run, we need to do better than that. We have to actually improve the climate change by stabilizing emissions, number one, and then by taking lots of carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that's a very long-term process, but it's happening on the climate change is happening on such a long time scale that it's not going to help us in the next decade or even 2 decades. And so we have to do the adaptation to improve the fire response. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask?
It was very good presentation. Thank you. I did have a question back about the chaparral, and I got the impression that something was said about the fires helping the chaparral to some extent in its growth, or
well, the chaparral, in order to reproduce, it has to have fire. So if you go for many hundreds of years without burning at all, the chaparral will die. So it needs that.
Some fire.
But on the other hand, and this is sounds funny, but if the fires happen too often, the reverse happens and it kills out the chaparral.
And George, the reason for that is that they need the fire to scar the seeds so the seeds will reproduce.
Right.
I see.
If the fires come too often, then that seed bed gets destroyed.
I see. I see. Oh, okay. Okay, that makes sense.
It's
Thank
a little
you.